Gracias. Over to you, Mariko.
Merci, thank you. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this workshop introducing the Canadian import process and the safe food for Canadian regulations. My name is Marie-Claude Tardif. I'm the Deputy Director of the Technical Cooperation Unit within the International Affairs Branch at the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. My group is in charge of coordinating technical assistance activities that fall under the Canadian Food Inspection Agency's mandate, which cover animal health, plant health, and food safety. Today, Ms. Alia Blais from the Policy and Program within the Food Import and Export Division at the CFIA will present information that we hope will facilitate your ability to ensure that products that are being produced in your country and being exported to Canada will meet the import requirements for Canada. There will be a question and answer session at the end of the webinar to further help you understanding the Canadian requirements. This is a great opportunity for exporter considering Canada as an export market. I would like to thank the whole team at AICA Canada and the staff within my group at CFIA who helped organize this webinar. At the end, we will ask you to kindly fill out a questionnaire to help us improve this type of webinars. I sincerely hope that you enjoyed this session today. And now, Dr. Jean-Charles Lavallée will do his opening remark. Thank you.
Merci, Marie-Claude. Welcome, everybody. So I'm the country representative for ICA in the Canadian delegation here in Ottawa. I'd like to send out a warm welcome to everyone across the Americas today and joining us on this exciting webinar. Very important in this market. If you're looking to export to Canada, especially say if you're going to choose fruit, it's a growing market. Canadians are getting older. They're looking for healthier product. They want to eat more fruit and produce and vegetables. And it's a growing market. We last year imported, in terms of fresh fruit, we imported over 6 billion Canadian dollars, and processed we imported close to 5. So together, that's $11 billion market in terms of imports annually to Canada. And if you're wondering what kind of imports those would be, well, you're thinking of grapes in terms of dollars, in terms of value. Grapes come first, they're about 10%. Bananas are about 10%, and strawberries are close, about 8%. And so if you're thinking of where we import produce from, that would include the States. They're the largest market, the US, followed by Mexico, 16%, Chile is about 5-6%. And then Guatemala, Costa Rica, Peru, all have 4 or 5% of the import market in terms of fresh fruit. When you consider exporting to Canada, the importer, the number one thing that is on their mind is food safety. And they're going to ask you if you're HACCP certified, if you have GFSI, so Global Food Safety Initiative, and other questions like that. Food safety is the most important part. It's important to Canadians and it's important to this market. And if you want a purchase order, it's important to get that with understanding with you. Otherwise, what they're going to ask about is reliability of supply. You know, they want regular containers every week. You know, if you have one container every 6 months, they're not that interested. So they want a regular supply. And then they're looking for quality. So they're going to ask about freshness and that kind of thing. So I'm really excited about this webinar. We've done this before. We've worked CFI, we worked with Ms. Blais. She's done a great job in other regions of the Americas, and we're really happy to renew this partnership with the CFIA. Our sincere thanks to them. And so please use the chat function if you have any questions. And we'll be monitoring also YouTube and Facebook. And at the end of the presentation that Ms. Blais will give, we'll be happy to entertain those questions and any new ones that arrive at the time, followed by the questionnaire that Marie-Claude mentioned earlier. So sincere thanks for your participation. I'll pass it over to Ms. Blais. Over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Lavallée. Okay, so I'm going to get started. Let me just do a quick share of my screen. Okay, Good morning, everyone. My name is Aliyah Bleh, and I work in the International Affairs branch of the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. So I'm going to display the presentation in Spanish, but I believe an English version of the presentation can be found in the chat. So this morning, I would like to provide to you an overview of importing food into Canada, as well as an overview of the Safe Food for Canadians regulations. We'll go over a little bit of the labeling requirements and some information on food safety standards and guidelines. And then at the end of the presentation, if we have some time, I would like to take a quick peek at the CFIA website, just to give you a quick look at some of the information that's available to you. So I know that Dr. Lavallée mentioned this in his opening remarks, but to give you a little bit of the Canadian context, Canada is the 5th largest importer in the world, and we import approximately $44 billion per year from over 191 countries. Now, roughly around 40% of the food products sold in Canada are imported, and many of the foods produced in Canada are produced with imported ingredients. The CFIA, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, has a broad mandate that encompasses food safety, animal health, and plant health, as well as international market access. So this slide outlines a little bit about the CFIA's history and our vision, but in short, we can say that we're a science-based regulator, and our goal is to ensure the well-being of Canadians, our environment, and our economy. Now, we achieve our mandate by preventing and managing food safety risks, sustaining the plant and animal resource base by protecting plant resources from pests, diseases, and invasive species. We're preventing and managing animal and zoonotic diseases. We're contributing to the consumer protection, and we are facilitating market access through a food, animal, and plant regulatory regime that supports competitive and domestic and international markets. So when we speak about imported food, CFIA is not the only government organization that plays a role in imported food. There are other government organizations in Canada that provide oversight to imports to ensure that they're compliant with the applicable standards and regulations. And they also take appropriate enforcement action when industry is not compliant. So Health Canada, their responsibility is for establishing national health and safety and nutritional standards for food in Canada. And so they set the standards for food safety and nutritional content of food. They conduct health risk assessments and evaluations on food contaminants and additives. And then they approve the use of food additives, and they set residue tolerances for foods. Global Affairs Canada, they are the lead for the negotiation of free trade agreements. And they also have the role of issuing permits for some of the supply managed agricultural products that we have here in Canada. And then the last one that is on my list here on the slide is the Canada Border Services Agency. So what they do, and I'm going to refer to them as CBSA. So what CBSA does is that they assist in the administration and enforcement of the legislation as it applies to imported products. So they are really the initial import inspection, and they perform those at airports and Canadian points of entry, so the borders. And typically the customs inspectors will review the import documentation to ensure that all of the required permits or certificates or licenses are presented before the goods or the product is released into Canada. And then the other thing that they do is that they will do inspections and on the shipment. So they'll verify that the information that's on the documentation matches that shipment that is trying to come into Canada. They are our first point of contact with the imported goods. So we do work very closely with the CBSA because a lot of information flows between both of our agencies. And we will typically liaise with the CBSA during border inspections, and we will also take advantage of their border lookout process in order to identify high-risk goods that are entering the country. So this illustration shows the shared responsibility across the import continuum, and it shows how CFIA works with the Canada Border Services Agency. So as I mentioned, CFIA sets the policies and regulations for the imports, and these imports, these regulations and policies are enforced by the CBSA at the Canadian border. Now, what's important to take away from this illustration is that foreign exporters and suppliers should be working with their Canadian importers to understand the requirements to import into Canada and to identify any requirements that may be unique from other foreign trading partners. So what I mean by that, so some examples would be in Canada, we have a requirement for French and English labeling. We have specific priority allergens that need to be labeled, and we will have also our own set of approved food additives and chemical residue limits. So things like priority allergens or chemical residue limits can differ between Canada and other trading partners, for example, with the US or the EU. So it's important to understand what those specific Canadian requirements are. Now, this image, it summarizes the generic import process. So we can see that there's 6 parts to the import process. That first part being the requirements. And so CFIA sets the requirements based on our import policies and our regulations. And we make those requirements available to the importers through our automated import reference system, or it's otherwise called AIRS. Now, this is an online reference system that outlines the documentation and permissions that are required for an imported product to be granted permission to enter Canada. The second part of the import process is the permissions. So this is the importer's responsibility. The importer is responsible for obtaining the appropriate permissions to import. With respect to food products, all imported food requires that the importer holds a Safe Food for Canadians license to import. And depending on the food commodity, there may be other certificates or permissions required from a plant or animal health perspective. So once the importer understands what the requirements are, they've obtained their appropriate permissions, then we can move on to importing the product and receiving clearance. So what happens at that point is that the importer will submit their import declaration prior to importing the product, prior to the product arriving at the border, and they will need to obtain that authorization, that permission, that clearance to say yes, you've met the requirements, and yes, the product can enter. So once the shipment arrives at the border, in the fourth step of the import process, that's at the border. And again, as per the previous slide, this is where the shipment will encounter CBSA. And at that point, CBSA will examine the shipment or the documentation, and they will determine whether or not the shipment can be granted permission to enter Canada. Now, if the shipment is not permitted to enter, it may be returned to the foreign supplier or the exporter in the foreign country. So once the shipment has passed the border, it's been released by CBSA, it can then move to its first destination. Now, first destination at that point in time, depending on the food commodity, it may be determined that we would like it to be held for a further inspection by CFIA, or it'll be permitted to be released to the Canadian marketplace or continue on its journey. And then the last part of the import process is reporting. And reporting can occur at any of the other parts during any of the part of the import process. And we do that just to ensure that the process is running smoothly and is clear for industry. Now I'm just going to go into the Safe Food for Canadians regulations. So the Safe Food for Canadians regulations, or SFCR, as I'll refer to it, came into force on January 15th, 2019. And the SFCR was created by simplifying and consolidating 14 previous food regulations into one single set of regulations. So prior to the SFCR, we had 14 different food regulations based on the type of food commodity. The SFCR is consistent with international standards such as Codex and align with preventive approaches being implemented by many trading partners. It is prevention focused and outcome based. It applies to food that's being imported, exported, and traded between Canadian provinces. And it also applies to food animals when the meat products derived from the animals will be exported or sent across Canadian provinces. There are some provisions within the regulations under the traceability section and the labeling section that apply to all food, whether or not it'll be traded between provinces. And so for an example of this would be the bilingual labeling requirement or net quantity labeling requirement. So there are three different parts to the Safe Food for Canadians regulations, and that is the licensing, preventative controls, which also include preventative control plans, and traceability. And these were the key transformational components of the regulations. So I'm going to go over these pieces in the slides to come, just to give you an overview of what the Canadian regulatory requirements are. The goal of licensing in the SFCR is to assign accountability and enhance the rigor of food safety up and down the food supply chain. It is activity-based and is determined by what the person is doing and less by what they're producing. The intent of the licensing requirement is to also further align Canada's regulations with the international food safety standards and to improve access to global markets. So when we're speaking about the licensing requirements in the regulation, it's the person that is importing food into Canada that needs to have that SFC license. So typically that is going to be the importer who is located in Canada. Now, as a foreign supplier, you do not need to have a SFC license to export food to Canada, nor do you need to register with the CFIA to export your food to Canada. You just need to work with a Canadian importer, an importer located in Canada. The second key component of the SFCR is the preventative controls. Now, the preventive controls are steps that a license holder must take to prevent, reduce, or eliminate food safety hazards. They are outcome-based, where possible, to allow for flexibility and innovation. The preventive controls also include procedures for investigations, complaints, and recalls. The preventive control requirements are based, again, on internationally recognized principles of food hygiene, including the good manufacturing practices, good agricultural practices, and the principles of hazard analysis and critical control points. The importer that you work with will want to ensure that the food that you're supplying them have been manufactured under preventive controls. So a part of the preventive controls is the preventive control plan. And the Preventive Control Plan is a written document that demonstrates how the risk to food and food animals are identified and controlled. Now, the Preventive Control Plan also includes a description of measures taken related to consumer protection and market fairness requirements. So, importers must maintain a PCP for the food that they're importing. So what you may get are questions from the importer about the food safety hazards and control measures that are in place for the food. Now, there are templates and guidance on the preventive control plans on the CFIA website. So I do recommend taking a look at the guidance that was developed for importers so that you're aware of the information that the importer will need to know about their products. The last transformational requirement in the SFCR is traceability. And the traceability requirements align with those of international standards and aim to trace the food one step forward and one step back through the supply chain. The importer will be required to keep traceability documents for the food they import. So there are three main things that the importer will need to do. They will have to identify the product, and that's going to be through the product details, including the common name, name and principal business, place of business, lot code, or any unique identifier. They will need to trace back, so the date on which the food was provided to them and who supplied that food to them. And then they'll have to trace forward, and that is to whom they've provided the food and on which date it was provided. So the importer will want to ensure that the products they are importing are labeled with a lot code or a unique identifier. This will help them to meet this part of the regulations. So to summarize the requirements for importing, the importer will need to have a license to import food. They will need to have a preventive control plan. They will need to maintain procedures and processes for handling and investigating complaints and recalls. They'll need to keep clear and complete traceability records, which I just spoke about in the previous slide. And they will have to ensure that their foreign supplier is manufacturing, preparing, storing, packaging, and labeling the food under same conditions as food prepared in Canada. Now, when you work with an importer that's located in Canada, they're going to want some information on the products. And this is going to help them to better understand the hazards that are reasonably expected to occur. So they may ask for information about the manufacturing practices and the safety controls of the food being exported. They may ask how you are addressing any hazards associated with the food. If you are a part of a food safety certification program, they would want to know maybe what was your standing in that program, or what was the result of your last audit from that program. And on some occasions, they may ask to visit you and to be able to verify and see the effectiveness of your controls for themselves. All of this information that they're asking for, this is really going to help them to build a strong preventive control plan. So when we're exporting food to Canada, I think that it's very important to understand the different commodity groups and to ensure that the food is fully meeting the requirements for that commodity. So foods are grouped into commodities for the purposes of issuing the license, the SFC license to importers. Also, we use this commodity grouping to determine the risk of the food safety risk. So when we look at the commodity groups under the SFCR, we find dairy, eggs, fish and seafood, fresh fruit and vegetables, honey and honey products, manufactured foods, maple and maple products, meat and poultry products, and processed fruit and vegetables. Now, these larger commodity groups that I just mentioned are further broken down into sub-commodities. So to give you an example, the egg commodity, that would cover things such as shelled eggs, processed egg products such as liquid or dried eggs, and composite egg products such as omelet mixes or frozen breakfast egg sandwiches. So there's a broader category and then there are subcategories beneath it. I've I've provided a link on this slide, and so this slide will give you an example. This is the guidance that lists all of these commodity groups and provides a lot of good examples of what would fall in there, and it also elaborates more on the sub-commodities. So I do recommend that you take a look at the information that's on that web page. So there are actually a few commodity groups that I do want to highlight because they do cause regular confusion for importers and their foreign suppliers, because these commodities tend to share similar characteristics, and depending on the country of origin, they may be referred to differently or categorized differently in the exporting country. So these commodities are fresh fruit and vegetables, manufactured products, and processed fruit and vegetables. So if we just take a look at the fresh fruit and vegetables and the processed fruit and vegetables, we can, I'd like to go through some of like what would fall into these categories. So the SFCR has specific definitions for these products, but I think for the purpose of this presentation, it's probably easier to just provide you with some examples to get a better sense of what does fresh mean and what does processed mean. So some examples that would fall under fresh produce are whole, washed, sliced, cored, peeled, grated, chopped, or cut fresh fruit or vegetables. This would also include prepared salad kits that you would find in bags. Now, under the commodity of processed fruit or vegetables, we're going to find things such as fruits or vegetables that are packed in hermetically sealed packages. And so, for example, those are fruit cocktails or canned breadfruit. We would also find frozen fruits or vegetables, fruit or vegetable juices, jams, jellies, or chutneys, and would also find dried fruit or vegetables in this commodity group. Now, with manufactured foods, it is a common misconception I've seen that it is assumed that foods that are packed in cans or jars are manufactured foods. But what we saw from the previous slide is that fruits or vegetables that are in cans or in hermetically sealed packaging fall under the commodity of processed fruit and vegetable. So when we look at manufactured foods, they're typically foods that you would not, or foods that would not fall in one of the other food commodity groups. And so some examples of that would be confectionery foods, snack foods, chocolates, beverages such as coconut water, tea, coffee beans, fats and oils that are derived from plants, dried herbs and spices, nuts, grains, or seeds, processed grain-based foods such as baked goods or flours, cereals or rice. And then we have other things such as infant foods or composite foods or nut butters. So this is a small example of the types of foods that would fall into the manufactured food commodity group. But if you were to go take a look at the guidance document that I mentioned a couple slides ago, that has all of the commodity groups, it provides further information or further breakdown in terms of examples that would be that would fall within this commodity. Now, regardless of the food being imported, all foods imported into Canada must meet the requirements of the Safe Food for Canadians regulations. So this means that the food must have been manufactured or grown under the same conditions as food that would be prepared in Canada, and the importer will need to have a license to import that food. Now, depending on the food product, there may be specific compositional standards or grades that must be met, including container sizes or fills. These grades and standards are part of the SFCR in what I call, or what we call, not I, but we call the IBR documents. And they're also outlined in our food and drug regulations, which I haven't mentioned in this presentation, but it is, it's a regulations under Health Canada, who, as I mentioned in my first or second slide, they're responsible for setting these standards. So the IBR documents are incorporated by reference, and that's what IBR stands for. So it is actually a part of the regulations, which is why it's important to ensure that the product is meeting those standards and regulations. When exporting organic foods, they must be shipped with the appropriate organic certificates, and they need to meet the organic labeling requirements. So when you're producing food for the Canadian market, it is important that you speak with your importer to ensure that the products will meet any applicable standards related to that commodity. After understanding the type of food, it's important to understand how these foods must be labeled. Most prepackaged foods sold in Canada are generally required to adhere to the Canadian labeling requirements. And so what that means is that it must be labeled with a common name, and that's going to be on the principal display panel. And there are some exceptions to having the label of the common name. And those are things such as fruits and vegetables that may not be packed in a container, or they're in packaging that is makes the product easily identifiable through the package. Foods will require date marking and storage instructions. So for prepared packaged, prepackaged products, having a durable life date of 90 days or less, they must be marked with a durable life date. So that would be a best before date. And it would require storage instructions if it needs to be stored outside of room temperature. The labeling also requires the dealer name and place of business. So it needs to be identified with the principal place of business of the company that's responsible for the product, such as the importer or the manufacturer. When a food product is wholly manufactured outside of Canada, the label must show that the product has been imported. There needs to be a list of ingredients and allergens on the label. And so the ingredients list must be according to the requirements, and including those for the allergen requirements. And in Canada, there are 10 priority allergens. These include eggs, milk, mustard, peanuts, seafood, sesame, soy, sulfites, tree nuts, and wheat and other cereal grains that contain gluten. Additionally, on the label, you're required to have on the principal display panel the net quantity, and that must be in metric units. And then the nutritional facts table is also mandatory on the label and must be presented as per the requirements. Now, again, I mentioned this earlier, labels must be both in French and English. And the representations on the food label must be truthful and not misleading. And for imported food, the country of origin is required. So there's a lot of information here regarding the labeling requirements, but it is important to discuss with your own importer what elements of the labeling requirements is required for the product that you're exporting. When you export food to Canada, you must also ensure that the food conforms with the food safety standards and guidelines for Canada. So, as you may recall in the earlier slides, I mentioned that some standards for food in Canada may not be the same as the food that you may be sending to the US or the EU. So when making food to be exported to Canada, be aware of the requirements that are specific to Canada, such as established limits for pesticides in fresh produce, or permitted food additives and residue tolerances for other food products. Now on this slide here, I've listed some of the guidelines that have been established by both CFIA and Health Canada. And again, this information, these links can be found on our website under the heading Food Safety for Industry. So there's lots of information on our on the CFIA's website. So if you'd like to get more information on importing food, I do recommend that you visit the website, and I think it'll be a good exercise to take a look of what's there. And so when you're speaking with your importer and you guys are having these discussions about the food that you're going to supply, you'll both be on the same page, both have the same understanding of the requirements. So what I would like to do actually is maybe just take you to our website, just to give you a sense of what it looks like and how to maneuver. And I won't take too long to do this, but on the slide that I had up, the website address for the Canadian Food Inspection Agency is www.inspection.gc.ca. So when we get to this, we'll choose what language we come into. And so this is the main website of the Safe Food Canadians Safe Food for Canadians, Canadian Food Inspection Agency. Oh my. So on this page is the main landing page, and as we scroll down, there are certain areas that you can visit. Now, I spoke about the food labeling requirements, and that's where we would find this information, food label requirements. So everything that I had mentioned in the presentation is found here. There is actually, and again, there's standards of identities and grades to take a look at what is required for different commodities. And then there's industry labeling. So this is what goes into how things should be labeled in terms of core labeling requirements or very food specific information. I'm just going to go back very quickly. Again, I spoke about the food safety for industry webpage. And here again, food safety standards and guidelines, as I had shown you on the website, or sorry, in the presentation. Under this section, importing food, animals, or plant, I mentioned in my presentation, we have a mandate that covers food, animals, and plants. So when we look at this page, it covers all three. However, if you're looking at food, you would go to the food section under food imports. And here again, I mentioned in the presentation, preventive control plan for importers. It's a good piece of information here to help understand what information the importer will need for the preventive control plan. It just makes things easier when you're working together with your importer. Oh, and the last thing I would like to show you here is that list of food commodities. So under food licenses, as I mentioned, we create commodity groups for one of the purposes is for issuing the food license. And in this document, under food categories identified in the license application, this is where all of the commodities that I mentioned are, and the link that's in the presentation actually brings you to this section of the document or the web page. But again, it breaks it down into the commodities and then sub-commodities that I mentioned before. So I mean, that's a very quick jump at you know, through the website and taking a look at what's available there. But on your own time, you can take a look. This is the information that's available to you is also available to the importer. So it's, I mean, as I mentioned, it is very useful to be able to have the same idea of what what you're talking about and when you're discussing the plans for exporting your product to Canada. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much for listening, and we can move forward with the question period.
Great presentation, Ms. Blais, much appreciated. We're getting questions in the chat. If you could share the link that you were just showing on the CFIA website in the chat, so that people can be able to get to the different sections, licenses and labeling,
Yes.
or to general website, I guess. We have questions. I would say to the public, please, we aren't monitoring and we won't respond to the Q&A section of Zoom. Please add all of your questions in the chat directly. And so in the Q&A quickly, we had people asking about hemp. If you could comment on that at all, or I saw there's a question about products made out of chicken meat. So I don't think they know that we have supply management potentially here. And maybe you can answer that. And then I also have a few additional elements I can add myself after you've answered these questions.
Okay, so the first question you said was on hemp.
Yes.
So in my presentation, I referred to, and I did not show this when we went to the website, but I referred to the automated import reference system. And in that system, we do list the requirements for hemp. So again, if you're using hemp in a food capacity as a food, then the importer will require a license to import. And there's, as far as I recall, there's no other further requirements for hemp when using it for food. I know that we do. We have a lot of people that eat hemp hearts, etc., and use hemp in baking and cooking here in Canada. So what was the second question?
It was on chicken, actually.
Chicken. Okay, so with respect to meat and poultry products, in order to export to Canada products that contain chicken, for example, there is a requirement in the regulations to have an approved food safety system, food safety inspection system. So that means, let me just very quickly double check what we have here. That means that if you'd like to import products that contain poultry, we would have had to come to your country and done an audit on your inspection system and have specific approved establishments that would be allowed to export meat products to Canada. I'm going to put into the chat a link to the information that we have. So we do have on our website a list of foreign countries and that are eligible to export meat products to Canada. So I'm going to put that in the chat so you can take a look and verify whether or not your country does have an agreement with us. Just very quickly. Unfortunately, if there's no approval of your country's inspection system, you would not be able to export products to Canada. And then, so I posted two different links, and those are to the information related to whether or not a country is eligible to export and whether or not there are establishments from that country that are eligible to export. The bottom line is that not all establishments would be eligible. You have to have specific permissions and you need to be listed on our list.
There's another question. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I was going to ask you if there's any.
Yeah,
what was the
good
other?
timing. Same. Thinking the same thing. People had there are quite more questions about MRLs, and so pesticide limits and that kind of thing. Where can they get that information for their product?
So the MRLs are set by Health Canada, but so actually these are great questions because I can just post the links in the chat to that information. I had the link in one of my slides under the food safety standards and guidelines, but I will actually post in the chat the link to that information on our website. And so the link that I'm going to post, you'll see that it'll have a link for permitted food additives. It'll have a link for maximum levels of chemical contaminants that are allowed in foods. And then there's maximum residue limits for pesticides as well in there. Having worked with that, I know that they're constantly changing. It's always a good idea to verify that list that Health Canada has on a regular basis, because there are times where they do update the limits.
And when you're posting in the chat, just make sure it goes to all panelists and attendees, so the attendees can see the links too.
Oh,
I think some of your postings are only the panelists.
I see that Isabel has reposted. Okay, perfect.
Yeah,
sorry about that.
We're doing our best to do some of that too. A lot of specific commodity, like how do they find out a list of buyers, importers? Where would they get that information?
That's a good question. There are a few. So CFIA ourselves, we do not keep a list of importers. Mm-hmm. A lot of times, from my experience, I've had questions from foreign exporters before who are looking to figure out who needs to hold the license, and if they have a client, usually that client already has a license here in Canada. But I think there are, if I'm not mistaken, certain businesses or organizations here in Canada that can give a list of importers. But to be honest, we don't carry.
I think Industry Canada.
Industry, yeah.
I said we'll have a database. You can see the importers and who those competitors are. I would say the other questions that we're getting are about organic products, coffee, tuna even. What I'm going to do maybe is provide more information to attendees in Spanish.
Okay.
Entonces, para que conozcan mejor el consumidor canadiense.
Just to help you know a bit more about consumers here and our market in Canada, consumers in Canada are very well informed. They are very demanding and very much aware of prices. There's double income in most families, but the trend is to see single people households increasing as well. But as they age, consumers look for better quality in their products, and they are willing to pay a premium for better quality products. There are many immigrants in Canada. They pay more for their food, especially because they want to see food from their own country. So there's a very multicultural atmosphere, if you will, but there are regional differences. In Quebec, they eat mostly at home. They eat a lot of fruit and vegetables, more fats and salt and sugar. The larger cities are for consumption are Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver. Vancouver is more towards the Pacific side and very Asian oriented. There's a lot of knowledge in technology, internet, many mobile phones. So people use this, for example, to look at the labeling. And it's very important over here to have bilingual labels. People over here are very health conscientious and very much environmentally aware. So there are some trends in certain market segments. Looking at some of the other questions, we do have other areas with great growth, market growth, healthy products or products produced with healthy material. Organic products have grown about 300%, but it's a very small part, like 4 or 5% of the market, of all the Canadian market. Not all products have to be organic. What is called in French biologique. It's not necessary for them to all be organic. Most of the products are not. And of course, there's a premium for these. Younger people and people that are looking for healthier products are willing to pay more for that. There's also many gluten-free products or products without nuts or peanuts. We are seeing many vegan products, ethnic products, also many processed with materials, with recycled material. That's very popular. The trends to the future are low sugar content, low fat, high fiber content, and probably then vegetables and organic grains. There's growth in those areas. Snacks also, because we tend to eat 3 times a day, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. But then between meals, people tend to eat snacks. And there's grains, nuts, seeds. And so these are generally easily openable packages. There's a combination of fresh and frozen. With individual portions, though, that's something we're seeing. Many halal products culturally also, or kosher products, or non-GMO is also popular. If we look at fruits and vegetables, but I'd like to add some more info. We import about 80% of fresh produce because, of course, we do have fresh produce here, but in the summer months, June to September, July to September. So we mostly export from October to April, although it is year-round. Mexico and Brazil record 40% of export value or import value for agricultural products here. So they're the of the Latin American countries, the ones that most provide. The fruits that are mostly consumed here are berries. It's raspberries, blackberries, blueberries. And we also have banana, apples, grapes, and oranges. And what we see in terms of growth, we see mango, pineapple, tropical fruits that are growing. They're the most consumed. And well, that depends on preferences of consumers, but because our consumers are traveling more, they discover more of the products available in the South or in the tropics, and they want those available in Canada. So we see very big growth. I think in 10 years, it has increased 350%. Avocado, especially Mexican avocado. And as I was saying, in Vancouver, immigration from Asia leads consumption of Asian vegetables. So there's an increase, especially in the west side of the country, 15 to 20%. We do need certifications. I saw questions regarding this. Depending on the product group or the sector, such as frozen or processed fruits and vegetables, they need a HACCP certification. And if it is with IKF technology, the processor needs GFSI, SQF. There's several certificates necessary depending on the group. It could be cassava, plantain. Then there's also GAP standards. So I recommend you look at the information included for that document. It's you have to register for this, but it's very useful and it's available.
So I tried to answer a lot of the questions that I've been getting in the chats all in one answer, a long answer. And so I'm trying to see if there's anything that maybe for you, Alia, yeah, French and English labeling requirements.
Yeah, because I think there was a question on whether if it was going to Toronto, whether or not it needed the
Right.
French, and regardless of where it's going, the label needs to be in French and English.
Anywhere in Canada.
Anywhere in
Bilingual
Canada.
labeling. Yes.
Yep.
And we actually sometimes laugh at the French translations from time as a consumer. They're not exactly one for one, but okay, make sure those work. Does it manage electronic certification systems?
We do have some electronic certification systems. Actually, I think I'm misunderstanding what I was thinking of something else.
Is any part of the certification process done electronically? Or is it all
Only
paper?
right now we only have that with Australia and New Zealand.
Okay. And I see there's some questions about trade shows, and I really highly recommend SIAL Canada, SIAL. And so it's probably the most important import trade show in the country every year. It's virtually now, and it's free. So I would highly recommend it. If you were to come in person, now you can do a trade mission that'll cost money. And next year, once COVID's done, they will be in person again. That's probably the best way to meet various buyers in this country in one spot. It's very well known. They alternate between Montreal and Toronto every year. What else is there in terms of questions? Do you need phytosanitary certificates on your product?
That depends on the specific fruit or vegetable. In general, if it's something that's a root vegetable, that could come in with soil, or if it's a fruit or vegetable that we typically can grow here, sometimes you'll find a phytosanitary certificate requirement. That information, whether or not a product needs a phytosanitary certificate, you can find that in the automated import reference system for the product. I did post the link to the errors in the chat.
Is vegan, does it require a special standard? Is it Canada or CFIA that runs the standard, or is it a private label?
We don't have a standard for vegan per se, but I would point out that if you're going to label something as vegan, that label has to be truthful, right? So the product needs to be actually vegan. So what CFI would do in terms of, and this falls under our consumer protection and market fairness aspect, in terms of having labels that are truthful to the product that's there. So CFIA would verify, is that product actually vegan, by doing testing to ensure that it does not contain any products that would not label it as vegan. But there's no particular standard for vegan.
Okay. How can a business verify the tax registration number or get more information about a Canadian company to ensure that they have trust in the buyer?
Can you repeat the question?
So they're interested in the business information, the tax registration numbers, the they want to get to know the buyer better to develop that relationship, the trusts between the buyer and the seller.
So it's not something that we at CFIA would be managing. I think this has a lot to do with the conversations that you have with the buyer. CFIA does maintain a list of license holders, SFC license holders on our website. But in terms of tax information, etc., those are, I don't think information not information that we have, but at the same time, not necessarily information that we would divulge.
Okay. I'm getting questions about this YAL show. So I'm going to put that in the chat. And then I had another question about, so that's for trade shows. I'm going to put a link for TFO Canada. And so I will put it in Spanish. Right, it's the same link, that works well. So I really highly recommend this group, TFO Canada. They help people get to understand the Canadian market. They have a manual about the certifications, about how to export to Canada. Need to register. So I'll put that information in the chat. TFO Canada, you need to register to obtain their export manual in Spanish. I'm not sure I understand the question. Nationalism. There's a lot of questions, but they're not answers we can provide. More information on organic certification.
Okay. So we have a particular group at CFIA that does verification of organic systems in foreign countries. To import a product that's organic with a specific organic certification, that certification needs to be approved by CFIA. We do have a list, actually. We do have a list of, I'll find that on my website, but we do have a list of the current organic certifications that we have approved. And we do that.
There's another question about the length, the timing, the delays in import clearance processes. If they come by air or by boat.
So what we recommend in terms of the import process, now understanding that certain things, depending if it's coming by boat, it takes a little bit longer. But I don't think, like, once it's arrived in Canada, it's typically quite quick, unless there's a problem with the product itself, or the admissibility permits and certificates. If those are not available, then that could delay the entry. But in general, it doesn't make too much of a difference the mode of transportation of the product before it arrives in Canada.
Okay, I've got another question, but I'm trying to answer the chats at the same time. And I put another link. You will see for the attendees, if you want, you have to do your bit of your homework, but I gave you a link to the importer database at Industry Canada in the chat. So once you're there, you have to go in English or French, go through the database to figure out who the buyers are in what part of the country for your product. I mean, that you can find that kind of information. Do you have a link to the list of CFIA license holders?
Yes, I'll put that in the chat. I'm just going to post with respect to the organic question, some of the approved accredited bodies in different countries that we've already approved. I'm just going to put a link to that in the chat, and then I will provide the link to the list of CFIA license holders, or sorry, SFC license holders. My goodness, I'm having trouble.
There's a question also while you're doing that, wondering if all countries in the Americas can export to Canada.
All countries, yes. It depends on the product, right? So I mentioned that certain meat products, or what I didn't mention actually is live shellfish and meat products are the only two commodities where you need to have approval of the country in order to export to Canada. But in general, most commodities and food products can be exported from anywhere.
Any standards or restrictions regarding GMO?
Not at this time. We don't have any specific standards or restrictions with respect to GMO.
Any specific standard import issues related to honey imports?
So honey, there's no, well, okay, so with respect to honey, there are specific standards for honey that you will find out. Sorry, my computer is being a little slow, so I'm trying to, what I'll do is I'll post in the chat the IBR documents that I mentioned, where it lists all of our different standards, compositional standards. And so there is a specific standard for honey, and within the standard, it is known that it should not include any added sugars, because if it does, then it becomes, it's considered adulterated.
Right. Well, there's a question about that. How adulteration or country of origin mixes?
It has to be, I think it's permitted for mixing, but at the same time, it's all about the labeling and how it's labeled. If you're going to mix honey from two different origins, it needs to be apparent on the label that that is the case.
There's a question from Danilo. Do you have requirements to be a licensee to CFIA for particular people or companies?
So in general, there's only one other country where we permit license holders to be outside of Canada, and that's the United States. So any other country outside of Canada, the United States, the license holder must always be located in Canada.
If you're certified organic with the USDA EcoCert, are there additional requirements for the Canadian market?
As long as the the US certification, and that's the certificate that you have for the organic product. As long as they are approved with us, then there should be no problems.
And the more specifics about labeling, where on the package, is the back of the product, is it a sticker? You know, any more specifics you can give on that?
Is it labeling something specific or?
No, no product specifics, just a general question.
Okay. What I'll do is I will provide a link to the industry labeling tool. What's really great about that tool is that it provides information on where on the packaging labels or the particular parts of the labels must be. So a couple of the things I mentioned in the presentation, I mentioned the principal display panel, and that's typically the front part of the label, such as the common name, net quantity, and then the nutritional facts table are typically located behind or at the back. Again, it depends on the type of product, because understanding that depending on the product, they could be labeled, and that because not everything is in a box, could be labeled a little bit differently. But I'm going to put that link in the chat now. It talks about the different aspects of labeling with respect to language, country of origin, nutritional labeling, etc. It talks about any sort of claims or statements that you would make on that label, including things about organic certifications or health claims. And then it has some specific food labeling requirements. So things that some of the folks have mentioned here with respect to honey or fresh fruit or vegetables. So any retail foods, all of that information is on this industry labeling tool.
And another question about Global Gap, Canada Gap, if they're required for fruit and vegetables that are fresh.
It's not a requirement, but it is something that is preferred because your buyer will have more, will be more assured that the product is meeting the Canadian standards. Now, if we know that something that is being grown or produced is under Canada Gap, for example, we know that that program has the elements that are similar to what is listed in the regulations. So, and I think that Dr. Lavallee mentioned at the beginning, like the importers in Canada will want to have those assurances when you are part of a certification program like that.
Can the labels be in two languages on separate labels, or do they all have to be in the same label?
So I guess this is more of a question about sticker labeling, I would assume.
Just language in this case.
So the preference is to have both languages on the label, so it's properly bilingually labeled. There are instances where it is permitted that the product, so if a product comes into Canada, only has the one language, it's considered not meeting the regulations. And if you have a business agreement with the importer that you're working with, that the label is not going to be meeting those requirements in the regulations, and that the importer here in Canada will have an extra duty to relabel or resticker or repackage the product. I mean, it's really up to what is decided between yourself and the importer in Canada and how you want to prepare this product for the market. But if the product, before it gets those store shelves, will have to have the French and English labeling.
Yes, it's a requirement, really. The importer too will insist on this. And on GFSI, you're going to find that the Loblaws, the Walmarts, the Sobeys, the Metros, the largest, Loblaw is like 40-45% of the market, retail market, and you tag on Sobeys and Metro, and you've got 75-80% of the market right there. Walmart is a smaller player here, but they tend to push down the supply chain, the GFSI requirements. So, that's, if you want to be competitive, it's best that you seek these kind of certifications. Private label quality schemes that are really important to the industry here. What kind of equivalencies do the rest of the Americas have in terms of organic or other certifications that is recognized, that Canada recognizes?
Let me just go back to the organic page here. So I think right now, and I did post this link in the chat, we have equivalency arrangements with certain certification bodies under, well, specifically for Costa Rica, the EU, Japan, Switzerland, the United States is one of our bigger ones, United Kingdom, and Taiwan.
So Costa Rica.
Costa
and the
Rica is
States,
there. Yep.
basically in the Americas,
Yep.
right? So we haven't really spoken about this, but there's a question about cost sharing, and how is the cost shared for the Canadian Inspection Authority to visit a potential exporter, which is not like the US system? What does the breakdown of the cost entail? I think there's confusion a bit between us and the US.
Yeah. So what you're mentioning is what the US does under FSMA and some of their specific rules with respect to produce, etc. Here in Canada at the CFIA, we don't do these types of visits. Sometimes we will go and visit, but it's not for the purpose of, it's not in the same type of capacity that the US would visit. And so there would be, when we do decide to visit, it would be more of an agreement between us and the competent authority in your country to come by and take a look at some of the establishments and to help with ensuring that products are meeting the Canadian requirements, but nothing, we don't go in there to specifically audit or
right. And the relationship they have with the Canadian importer is also different.
That's
from the
right.
US. Maybe expand on that.
The relationship that CFIA has with the Canadian exporter or importer, sorry.
They would have with our Canadian importers.
Right. So, I mean, I've seen a variety of different relationships between the importer here in Canada and the exporter in the foreign countries. And in some occasions, it's a really good relationship. So there's a lot of back and forth, there's a lot of agreements, there's a lot of assurances. I've heard of importers here going to visit with their suppliers because it provides a lot of confidence in the products that they're sourcing. And when they come back here to Canada, they have more confidence in when the product is coming into Canada. But CFI itself does not play any sort of role within that relationship between the importer and the exporter in the foreign country.
So I don't think that's clear for many people who are looking at us as an export market. And I would add that the importers, they need communication on a regular basis, on a rapid basis. And ideally you have a website, you have an email, you answer, if they have a question, you answer within the same day. You have to build that trust relationship with the Canadian importer. And for them, communication is everything. And you're going to lose that purchase order if you don't answer quickly. So they may invest in the company after a couple of years, like it maybe a couple of months, but it usually they need a long-term relationship. They want to see the reliability of supply. They want to make sure your product comes in, that it's of good quality, you know, and price is negotiable. And anything else like environmentally friendly, you know, produced by women, it's nice to have. There are niche markets for that, but the larger markets, the larger volumes, where really what is most important is food safety. So you have to get, and the importer will help you get better understand that market. And I gave you an importer database, a link to it in the chat so that you can identify potential buyers of your product and reach out to them. They have websites, email addresses, phone numbers. And so the market here is highly competitive. And the population isn't growing very much. We're 37 million. We may grow in 2050 to 50, 55 million. The rest of the world will be growing to 9.5, 10 billion people. Like, so, I mean, we have strong purchasing power. We want to eat more produce, so it's a growing market. I see in the questions, you may be able to answer this. I don't know anything about rice. If there's anything specific there.
Is there a specific question, or in terms of just is
Yeah,
rice
mandatory
permitted?
regulations for rice exports.
There's nothing very specific to rice. Rice falls under the manufactured food commodity group. The requirement for rice to be able to import it, depending on the country of origin, there may be plant health requirements. Let me just double check very quickly. But in terms of import, the SFC license is required. And that's basically all about it, but give me.
Okay. And we're getting less and less questions now. I'm trying to review what we've through the list. Maybe you can speak to allergens. Big issue here.
Yeah. So the majority of our recalls that we have here on products in Canada are due to allergens. A lot of the times the misunderstanding is not knowing what those priority allergens are in Canada, because sometimes what we've seen is that in other countries, it's not an allergen there. So they don't consider it or they don't think about labeling that information. So the allergens we have here are very unique to Canada because that's what the population suffers from when they have allergens or allergic reactions, if you will. And so sometimes it's the smallest thing that's added in a product that you would not think that you would need to have it listed on the label. But Dr. Lavallée had mentioned earlier that Canadians, they have their cell phones with them all the time. They're looking at ingredients lists. They are looking at the label, and the biggest part of biggest assurances or biggest thing that they use here is that label and the list of ingredients to determine whether or not that food is safe for them if they do suffer from an allergic or an allergy and may have an allergic reaction. But like I said, the majority of our recalls here in Canada are due to the lack of allergen listings on the label and someone has suffered an allergic reaction.
And there's a question about if they can find a list of allergens for Canada.
Yes, I will put that in the chat.
And maybe we can take one last question. Translating here. The difference between processed and fresh fruit standards, regulations, and pesticides.
Okay, so the regulations are generally the same for fresh or processed fruits and vegetables, but they're prepared differently. So as I mentioned, fresh fruits are that they're fresh, and they could be peeled. It could be, let's for example take pineapples. So whether or not the pineapple is whole, just picked from the tree, or minimally processed so that it's you've peeled it and you've put it in the packaging, a hermetically sealed package. There's sorry, let me just go back for a second. If it's whole and it's not peeled and it's got freshly picked, or it's just been cut, so cored and peeled, those are considered fresh. As soon as we get to dried pineapple, for example, or something in a can or a jar with like a syrup, then those are processed. Now, what's the difference? You're probably thinking, okay, so how does the pesticide limits apply to this? Now, the pesticide residue limits will apply to the fresh product. Because when CFIA does our testing on, which is part of our inspection program, we do test fresh produce that come in, or fresh fruits that come in, and we will take that piece of pineapple or that pineapple and cut it up and do our laboratory test. We're checking for pesticides. But if it's a process, let's say it's in a canned pineapple, for example, the pesticides, in that case, what we're going to look at is whether or not there's any food additives in that canned product that is not permitted. Whether or not there is, let me go back to my page in terms of industry guidance, and I'll just tell you specifically. So I had posted a link to the food safety standards and guidelines. So with respect to the fresh produce, we're looking at pesticide limits, but with respect to something that is processed or dried, so I'm saying dried or canned or made into a jam or a chutney, what we're going to look at there is whether or not there is any chemical contaminants, and sometimes, and also if there's any food additives that are not permitted. Now, sometimes when we say chemical contaminants, sometimes foods can get contaminated while it's being processed. As it's going through the processing line, perhaps there was, perhaps the line was cleaned with some sort of cleaner that has now contaminated the food. So these are the types of things that we look at in terms of chemical contaminants. And then there's so if I just touch really quickly on other products like honey, I know someone asked a question about honey and the requirements. Something that I should have mentioned is that in terms of honey, we do test to see if there's any veterinary drugs in that honey. Because sometimes the bees are treated with antibiotics if they're ill, and sometimes those residues come through in the honey. And so there are certain permitted or banned substances, permitted levels, or certain drugs that are banned in terms of use or to be found in honey. Again, those are all in our list of standards and guidelines that I had mentioned. And I know I still have to post the allergen lists.
I've been posting a couple things in the chat that people are asking about the MRL database.
Yep.
Or they're asking about intolerances or the health claims, allergies. So you'll see I've been posting to all panelists and attendees. There's a question, I don't know who it's from. They're asking about zero emissions, greenhouse gases, cross-pollination, and for honey, but from bees, it's a low priority. Organic is as close as the environmental conscious, like the consumer is. The labeling for environmental issues are very few. You may see it in seafood. There's a lot more sustainability labeling in seafood than anything else. That doesn't mean that there aren't sustainable practices. It's just that it's not labeled in any way. And yeah, just so more questions about MRLs and pesticides. So I think we've covered pretty much all the subjects, questions, subject matter. I can't see anything else. Quickly, I'm checking the Q&A, even though I asked people not to use it, but yeah, we've answered those too. Good job, Ms. Blair.
Oh, thank you. It was a good team effort.
Yeah, no, and a wide range of questions. So my thanks to all the participants and on YouTube and on Facebook as well. I'm really thankful for everyone's time today. I hope the presentation was useful. I know there was confusion up front because you couldn't access the presentation in Spanish. Now you can. I think that was resolved, and you had both presentations in the share drive. So really wonderful to see you again, Ms. Blair. My thanks, Marie-Claude. Reminder to everyone, I would ask the people if you can stay on just a few minutes, because we'll be posting the link to the survey in the chat so that we can get your opinion. It's important for CFIA, it's important to us. So to assist our partners with these types of activities, events, webinars that are of great interest and value to the industry and people across the Americas. So we've posted it in English and Spanish. Thank you. Maybe Marie-Claude, you also would like to say a few words.
I wish everybody a nice afternoon. It was a very great session. You said it, Dr. Levalle. Ali Abled did a wonderful job. There's been a lot of questions. I've been taking notes to also see how we can improve those type of sessions in the future. I wish to thank also the interpreters who were there to translate the session. I wish that we'll do other session like this. It's been very interesting for all of us, I believe. So thank you very much.
Excellent. You can see some of the responses in chat. People are very thankful. They're hoping to access the presentation if it's allowable. They're hoping for more. They would like more further presentations like this. And just so you know, we do organize events with countries. ICA, we've worked with Guatemala a few weeks ago. We'll be working with El Salvador in coming weeks to talk about more specifically the export markets, the opportunities, the people in your countries. This is an initiative from ICA Canada, but ICA as a whole, we work with ALADI in the Cono Sur, and so in South America, in the Mercosur on export. We have a dedicated trade division at ICA headquarters, and our director is in Panama, but it's a priority for ICA, from commercialization locally to regional trade to exporting outside the Americas. So very thankful. I appreciate all the warm remarks, the kind remarks in the chat. My thanks to CFIA once again for partnering with us on this great event. Yeah, and there's great demand. There's thirst for this kind of information, and better understanding our export market is a great asset to them in their growth. So I guess I'm happy to close this session and wish everyone all the best. Please stay safe. We're not out of COVID yet, but should be soon, I'm hoping, and look forward to working with you once again, CFIA. My thanks again to the agency and the whole team there.
Thank you, Dr. Levalle, the whole team. Excellent coordination and the collaboration. Looking forward to work with you again. Thank you.
Pleasure, Chelsea. Take good care. Thanks to Gloria, Isabel, and Tix and people in headquarters. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.